Welcome to Down to Earth but Heavenly Minded podcast. Hosted by Irving Risch. Light from the Land of the Sphinx. Chapter 19, The Wilderness Entered. The remainder of this volume will be occupied with the consideration of some divine hints, as they may be termed, which are given in the book of Exodus, relative to the future blessing for man which God has in store. With God's revelation on Sinai of himself to man, with the manner of God's dwelling amongst men and the divine principle of access to himself, as displayed in the tabernacle of the wilderness. And also with a few remarks on Israel's wanderings. The overthrow of the typical ruler of the world, the priest-king, Pharaoh, set Israel free, and in the ways of God. Some 6 weeks afterward the redeemed people were established at Horeb, where God gave forth his law. The incidents of the journey from Ramesses in Egypt to the Mount of God in the wilderness, as related in the book of Exodus, have a significance of their own. The mention of certain stages in their journey is avoided. For the number of the journeys according to the places of the departure is not that which the Spirit of God is bringing before the reader of the book of Exodus, but other lessons. The incidents stand together, as historically recorded in the book of Exodus, and as spiritually noted in the 105th Psalm. The length of the period covered by the pilgrimage to Sinai is also significant. They departed from Ramesses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month, Numbers chapter 33 verse 3, and they came into the wilderness of Sinai, where a new dispensation opened upon them, on the first of the third month. Remembering that the earliest stages of their journey were in Egypt itself, verses 5 to 7, this would give some 38 or 40 days for the period of time in consideration, a period resembling, in days, that spent in years by Israel in the wilderness. The encampment by the Red Sea after Elim was left, and those at Dophkah and Elash, after leaving the wilderness of Sin, are not referred to in Exodus, but these encampments are amongst those which Jehovah commanded Moses to record. See Numbers 33. The psalm referred to, thus speaks of this period: he spread a cloud for a covering, and fire to give light in the night. The people asked, and he brought quails, and satisfied them with the bread of heaven. He opened the rock and the waters gushed out, they ran in the dry places like a river. He brought forth his people with joy, and his chosen with gladness, or singing, and gave them the lands of the heathen. See Psalm chapter 105 verses 39 to 44. In these words not a sound of Israel's murmurings, or of God's chastenings is heard, all is gladness and grace, and the wilderness itself is in view only as the occasion for God to show forth his favors. This, we shall see, is that which characterizes the period under our present consideration. The song of triumph having ended, the wilderness opened out before Israel. The borders of the Red Sea, where the Egyptian dead lay, were left, and the host went forward under the guidance of the pillar of cloud and fire. An entirely new era had now opened in Israel's history. They had become a pilgrim company. The intense strain of anxiety, and the sense of freedom incident to the marvels of the few days that had just elapsed, gave place to entirely new experiences. On such an occasion as the overthrow of Pharaoh's army before their very eyes, it would be but natural that each of the freed people, and also of the mixed multitude, should be absorbed with the deliverance. Hence the joy prevailing would allow no place for thoughts as to what might next happen, or as to which way they should take, in order to reach the promised land. In the sacred enthusiasm of the hour, all would join in the song, honestly anticipating a speedy entrance into Canaan. But Israel had to learn a deeper lesson than that taught by Pharaoh's bonds. Through their wilderness education they had to prove themselves. Pharaoh's bonds had shown to Israel their helplessness, their salvation had demonstrated to them Jehovah's strength. Their path through the wilderness would prove, if not to them, certainly of them, the unfaithfulness of their hearts, and also the faithfulness of God. We are able to trace the stages of Israel's journey to Horeb with considerable precision. Travelers have painstakingly followed Israel's track. England's Ordnance Survey has given us a strictly exact map of the deserts and wadis Israel crossed, and the rocks and the mountains which they could not cross and had to pass round. And the photographer has given us the scenery of the localities mentioned, so that we are capable of realizing the word pictures given by Moses in his narrative. We have introduced on the opposite page a map of the district from Pithom to Elim. The upper portion of it is practically the same as that which is given upon page 101, that part of it which indicates the country from Suez to the Wadi Garandal, Elim, is a careful reproduction of the Ordnance Survey. After their song Israel turned from the land of their captivity, and went out into, or towards, the wilderness of Shur. The long wall of rock which rises up over the flatter district near the sea gives the name of the wilderness of the wall, Shur, to the desert towards which they turned. We are supposing that they took their journey from near the point marked in our map that is, close by Migdol. There can be no doubt that on leaving the neighborhood of the store city, Pithom, they brought with them not only supplies of food but of water also. For months previously it had been known that they were to serve Jehovah in the wilderness, Exodus 5:1-7, and that young and old, sons and daughters, flocks and herds, Exodus chapter 10 verse 9, would form their company, and more. A 3 days' journey into the wilderness, Exodus 8:27, had been specified, hence to suppose Israel undertaking this journey without supplies of water that would last them some days is impossible. As they had ample time for preparation, there is no reason whatever for assuming that they did not make the necessary arrangements. Pithom, as has been already observed, was a store city, and from it, as a base, expeditions started across the wilderness to the mines in the Sinai district, and elsewhere. Israel's way was to the Mount of God. Hence they journeyed southwards, towards the wilderness of Shur. They did not bend their steps the more direct way towards their land of promise. And they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. Egypt had ever found them water, and in its river, water of noted sweetness, but their supplies brought from that land were lessening, and after their 3 days of toil, Marah, or bitterness, was reached with its brackish, unpalatable pools. The fact of a 3 days' journey into the wilderness and finding no water, and then the brackish pools, is attested by travelers who follow Israel's track. But God is not merely recording an incident in their way from bonds to rest, he is also communicating spiritual instruction. Israel was bound to a fruitful land, and the first great lessons learned on their way thither were the absence of refreshment natural to the wilderness over which they traveled, and the disappointing nature of the water frequently found there. Speaking of a pool in the Sinai district, the writer says, I was the first of our party to essay to drink of its water, but the Arabs exclaimed, Marah, Marah, Marah. It is bitter, bitter, bitter. The world, viewed as a desert over which God's pilgrim host is passing, affords in itself no nourishment, and should its waters be tasted they do but prove themselves to be disappointing. This is the first lesson in pilgrimage, the first realization of the 3 days' journey. 3 days' journey from Egypt brought Israel in triumph into the wilderness. 3 days' journey into the wilderness brought him to bitterness. And it may be said, there is not one among the pilgrim host of God, who has not learned, or who has not to learn, this important lesson of the 3 days. But as Israel mourned the bitterness, God showed Moses a tree, and he cast it into the waters, and the waters were made sweet. Exodus 15:25. Revised version. Israel had been delivered from Egypt, as it were by death. They had passed through the bitter water of the sea, and now they had to prove the bitterness of the wilderness. A bitterness which was rendered sweet for them. We are redeemed and delivered from the world and Satan by Christ's death, and such being the case, we are called to experience the practical excellence of Christ's cross as healing the bitterness of many an incident on our pilgrimage to heaven. Asterisk. It may be not uninteresting to remark that the word tree, in the Bedouin dialect, is simply synonymous with a drug or medicament of any kind. Where is Marah? Can it be identified? Supposing, as is now so generally accepted, that Israel's wilderness journey began in the locality marked on our map, from that point to Ain Musa, the wells of Moses would be some 3 days' journey of 15 miles a day. The wells there are still brackish, but one of them is said to be sweet, and a considerable fertility surrounds them. Indeed, in modern times they have become of very great service to Suez. Fruit and vegetables being produced in the little oasis which they furnish. The idea that these wells are on the site of the ancient Marah is very reasonable, and the fact that these wells are called by the name of Moses to this day, lends the strongest probability to its justness. The name of the great leader being still connected with the water he had rendered sweet. In the time of Moses the wells were probably enclosed and kept with great care by the Egyptians, for the use of the frequent convoys to and from their ancient settlements at Sabat el-Kadem and the Wadi Maghara. From bitterness rendered sweet, Israel journeyed to Elam, the trees, again a 3 days' journey. Here in the shade they encamped by the water, not of pools such as those of Marah, but fountains of living, upspringing water. From the wells of Moses we traversed an unvaried desert plain for 3 days. There is nothing to attract attention but the bleached camel bones that mark the track, and nothing to afford food for reflection but the thought that, like the children of Israel, you too have gone 3 days in the desert and have found no water. The desert of the Exodus. The numbers of the springs and palm trees of Elam would not be given without an intention, and we may understand that each of the 12 tribes had its own marching and camping position assigned to it by each spring, and that the 70 palm trees were used as headquarters for 70 chief princes, for the renowned of the congregation, princes of the tribes of their fathers, heads of thousands in Israel. Numbers chapter 1 verse 16, Exodus chapter 24 verse 9. The people were not only prepared for their journey, they marched in an ordered array according to their armies. In this grateful resting place, they encamped, by the waters. Incidental refreshment fell to their lot. Their faithful leader had led them where they could not only enjoy mercies, but prove his way of rendering the ordinary bitterness connected with their journey sweet. These are the chief lessons of the first month of Israel's pilgrimage. No one appears to question the position of Elam. The Wadi Garandal is such a perfect realization of the story of the first rest after Israel's exodus, that even controversy rests there. To this day the springs and groves of the locality are resorted to by travelers, and the photographer has made its features familiar to the eye. The eye is again refreshed by the sight of green tamarisks and feathery palms, and just off the customary track is a pleasant stream of running water. This is Wadi Garandal, generally regarded as Elam. And whether or no the grove and stream are the lineal descendants of the 12 springs and 70 palm trees, it is clear that the site of Elam must lie somewhere in the immediate neighborhood. The exact direction taken by Israel when they broke up the camp at Elam was much questioned, but the Ordnance Survey expedition has now set at rest most of the difficulties, and has enabled a very clear idea to be formed of the way they went. The destination was Horeb, the Mount of God. They were a great host, having baggage wagons, cattle, and much encumbrance, hence they could not have taken a mere mountain track, steep and rugged. Two main routes were open to them, known now as the upper and the lower roads. Our maps on pages 144 and 145 will make their route perfectly clear to the eye. The two roads divide at Wadi Ethel. The upper road lies by Wadi Hamra, Wadi Naesbi, Wadi Suwig, Wadi Carmele, Wadi Bark, Wadi Lebwe, Wadi Bera, and Wadi Es Sheikh, and so enters the plain of Rahah. As the next encampment of Israel after Elam was near the seashore, they removed from Elam, and encamped by the Red Sea, Numbers chapter 33 verse 10, it is evident they did not pursue the upper road. The reason why they did not do so is very simple. By consulting the map, page 144, Sarabat el-Qadim, issuing from Wadi Siwig, and Maharat near Wadi Shelal, will be observed. The former of these two places is in continuity of the upper road. They were both fortified, and occupied by Egyptian troops, who were told off for this service in order to protect the mining district. The mines were worked by slave labor. There is quite an interesting history of these mines in the Egyptian archives, and there are monuments in situ carved in the rock. One of these we give. At Wadi Naesbi there are great heaps of slag, and other vestiges of the Egyptian miners, who formerly colonized the place. The mines and quarries of the peninsula of Sinai were worked in the earliest times of Egyptian history. The inscriptions engraved on the rocks furnish us with a proof that the Egyptians kept up establishments in these desolate regions. The principal envoys of the king, the treasurers, artists, officials of the quarrymen, and other similar persons, never left their places without perpetuating on the rock the remembrance of their stay. There are tablets exhibiting kings, who present their offerings and allegiance to the protecting deities of the district. To the east in Suput and the heavenly Hathor. Had Israel taken the upper road, a conflict with the Egyptians must have occurred, but too much need not be made of such an eventuality. Another, and a more weighty reason for their not taking the upper road is this: it would have presented insuperable difficulties, by reason of its rugged passes and narrow valleys, to a large caravan encumbered by heavy baggage. A very simple reason for the direction taken by Israel is thus before us: they took the easiest and the readiest route, or, to use the language of Scripture, He led them forth by the right way. Psalm chapter 107 verse 7. On breaking up the camp at Elam, a fair day's journey brought them by Wadi Tayyibeh to the shore of the Red Sea, which they had not seen for some days. The place of this encampment was by the open coast. A scene of grandeur as varied as it is matchless, a vast semicircle of sheer precipice, some hundreds of feet in height, and which might contain a city in its noble sweep. Then, beyond this, a most singular peak, first tawny sandstone, then red, and then white, and then red again, then black. It must be at least 600 feet high. This is Wadi Tayyibeh, or the good, so called from its tafas, palms, and water. With the place of this encampment settled beyond controversy, we pursue on the map the direction of the lower road to Horeb. We have followed it across the Wadi Usite and seen it enter the Wadi Tayyibeh. The road now works round by the shore, at times leaving but little space between the cliffs and the water, and then crosses the barren flinty plain of El Marka. This may be regarded as the wilderness of Sin, which was Israel's next encampment. Rounding the hills by the sea, the Wadi Fairan is next reached. This long and comparatively narrow valley would not allow the same rate of daily marching as the open country, and we may suppose that the two stations Dofka and Alush were situated between El Marka and Rephidim. The waters and palms close by Rephidim, the hill whereon Moses prayed, and the locality of the battle with Amalek would be also in this valley. Thus, continuing by the lower road, and passing through the Wadi Salaf, the plain of Rahah is gained, where Israel assembled and received the law. If the priest-scribes of Ezra's period wrote the part of the second book of Moses which relates the way Israel took, it must be conceded that the description, at once so vivid and exact, was miraculous. How could men who acquired their knowledge in Babylonia imagine the position of the wells and the streams on the way, the breadth of the deserts traversed without water, the running waters and palms, the lower road from Elam, and the roundabout way to the sea, a day's journey? Such precision on the part of writers who had not visited the neighborhood would be tantamount to inspiration. But when we take the story as an account of an eyewitness, we are at once in the wholesome region of fact and common sense.